Good afternoon, everyone, or good lunchtime, good noon. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon. I just wanted to welcome everyone here to the East Tennessee History Center. We're very excited to have our speaker today, who I'll introduce in just a second. But I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and just to say that if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, I'd like to encourage you to join. We usually have a table with brochures on it. Oh, good. Yeah, where Dick is. Dick's back there with it. And also just to tell you about some of the upcoming events. So on November 10th, in the evening at 6 o'clock, or no, it's 7 o'clock, wow. We have an author event. Dr. John Saville is coming to speak for the Union Avenue Bookshop. And then we have 2 brown bags coming up. The next one is Georgiana Vines will be talking about stories that the media doesn't cover today. And that will be on November 16th at noon, like all the Brown Bags lectures. And the next one will be on December 1st, and it is about unique eats and eateries in East Tennessee, and will be by Paula Johnson. Well, I'm very excited to go to that to see where I can find the best chicken livers. I'm a big chicken livers fan, and so I hope she talks a lot about chicken livers, because if anybody knows a good place to get chicken livers, I'd like to know. So our speaker today, and in full disclosure, I should say, is on our board, so he's excellent, and I'll be making sure everyone agrees. Maury is an attorney from Chattanooga, and he practices in the area of employment litigation and labor law, so naturally, looking at our topic today, Jimmy Hoffa is a good fit. He graduated from Vanderbilt University. He got his BA, and he got his law degree from the Georgia School of Law. He has authored several books about history in Chattanooga, and including the book that he's speaking on today. And he has also served on a wide number of boards, including our own board at the East Tennessee Historical Society. So please join me in welcoming Maury Nicely to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. How are y'all doing? Well, good. Thank you all for having me up here. You know, when I signed up to do this, I went to the University of Georgia Law School, and I really didn't realize this would be the week that Tennessee and Georgia would be 1 and 2 and all this. So love me anyway. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about Jimmy Hoffa. Now, show of hands, who's familiar with Jimmy Hoffa? Yeah, I figured. I think the age drop-off is about 40. I think whenever I ask that question, people over 40 are like, oh yeah. People under 40 are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think everybody here is familiar with Jimmy Hoffa. How many of y'all are familiar with the fact that Jimmy Hoffa was tried in Chattanooga in 1964? Okay, a couple of hands. You know, that's really the beginning of the end for Jimmy Hoffa occurred in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And we're going to talk about kind of how we get there. Let's go back to the start. And of course, I'll take questions at the end. Somebody asked before the start, are you going to tell us where he's buried? And I said, you got to stay till the end. That's what's going to keep you here. So let's talk about Get Hoffa. When we really go back to the beginning of the end for Jimmy Hoffa, we go back to 1957. 1957 was the year that the McClellan Commission began. McClellan Committee was a bipartisan congressional committee that operated from 1957 to 1960, and the idea was they are going to investigate the influence of organized crime upon labor unions in the United States. And you can see behind me, you can see what the commission looked like when it was held in the Senate chambers in Washington. 2 individuals who were very involved in the commission were these 2 brothers. The one on the right was a Democratic member of the McClellan Committee. His name was John F. Kennedy. And the boy playing with the truck is his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy was the attorney for the McClellan Committee. And as the committee proceeded, it began to shed a spotlight on a rising star in the labor unions in the United States, a Teamsters leader who was vice president in 1957, but would become the president of the Teamsters by 1959. And his name was Jimmy Hoffa, James R. Hoffa. Now, like I said, in 1959, he became the president of the union. This is during a time, and we don't think this way today, But this is during a period of time where the president of the Teamsters Union was widely regarded as the second most powerful man in the country behind the president. The Teamsters controlled everything that's delivered, trucking, cradle to grave. So he held a great deal of power, and he developed, over the period of this McClellan Committee, a great hatred for Robert F. Kennedy. He began by referring to him as Mr. Kennedy, and then he called him Bob. Then he devolved, he called him Bobby, then Bobby Boy. And by the end of the McClellan Committee, he wouldn't even refer to him by name at all. He'd just call him you. They hated each other. And you can kind of see from these pictures. Hoffa appeared before the McClellan Committee 4 different times between 1957 and 1960. He and Kennedy developed what was called a blood feud. Kennedy really felt that with the power he held, that Hoffa was corrupt, and that he held too much power to be corruptible as he was. For his part, Hoffa viewed Kennedy as, and I think this is a quote, a rich, spoiled brat who never did a day's work in his life. There were several attempts, meetings, dinners brokered to bring them together to clear the air, and they always devolved into these episodes of toxic masculinity. They would debate who could do more push-ups. Hoffa said he could do 30. Kennedy said, well, I can do 50. And Hoffa said, well, how much does it take to lift a feather? And they at one point engaged in arm wrestling contests to decide who was stronger. I mean, just crazy stuff. As I said, Hoffa appeared 4 different times before the committee. I'll show you this picture because it's important. A number of Teamsters representatives and others who appeared before the McClellan Committee took the Fifth Amendment, right? I refuse to testify on the grounds, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it may incriminate me. One even took the Fifth so many times it was just ludicrous. Somebody asked, is this your son? And he said, I take the Fifth. Hoffa was unique in that he did not take the Fifth once during his testimony. There were concerns that if he were indicted, that the Teamsters Union could be thrown out of the AFL-CIO. So he didn't do it, but he had a number of other techniques that he would use to evade testimony. He would go on long, rambling discourses, not answering the question. He'd talk for 20 minutes and never approach answering the question. When they would say, well, you testified earlier, he would say, I never said that. And they'd say, well, it's in the record. And he'd say, I never said it. And that would force them, if they really wanted to dig into it, to go back in the record and look and see what he actually said. So he did all these things. And one of the other things that he did, that Bobby Kennedy talked about, is that he said every time I'd look over at him, he'd be giving me the finger. And that comes into the Hoffa trial in Chattanooga later as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, in 1960, the McClellan Committee wrapped up its findings, issued its findings, and was done. Hoffa breathed a sigh of relief. He's done now. He's done with what he viewed as the persecution of Robert F. Kennedy, and he can move forward with his plans. And then what happens in 1960? Kennedy's elected president. And one of the first things he did, names his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General of the United States. One of the first things that Robert Kennedy does is put together a team of 20 investigators and attorneys to try to find dirt on Jimmy Hoffa. They called themselves the Terrible 20, but everybody throughout the country called them the Get Hoffa Squad. Now, this is not technically how criminal processes work, right? Usually, a crime is committed, and we investigate to try to find out who committed the crime, right? What they were doing was saying, we've got a criminal, and we know he's a criminal, and we want to find a crime that he's committed. It's called predication, and you can't do this anymore, but at the time you could. And so Kennedy and his team brought numerous criminal indictments against Jimmy Hoffa, and every single time he would be found not guilty. And he had great techniques for how he got there. In one trial in Washington, he brought in, the jury was 2/3 black. And in the middle of the trial, he brought in the heavyweight champion of the heavyweight boxing champion, Joe Louis, came into the courtroom, shook hands with Jimmy Hoffa, told people what a good guy he was. This was during a break in the proceedings. I mean, just crazy, what we would call today playing the race card. And at the end of the trial, Kennedy said, Joe Louis is a pretty good boxer, but he makes an even better defense attorney. At the end of one trial in New York, Kennedy was so certain that he had Hoffa that he said, if we don't get him this time, I'll jump off the Capitol dome. And at the end of the trial, Hoffa mailed him a parachute, said, you may want this. So then we come to 1962 and the Test Fleet case. Test Fleet is a corporation. It was a trucking corporation. This case took place in Nashville in 1962. It took place in this courthouse, still the federal courthouse in Nashville. I think they're getting ready to build another one. But this was the courthouse where it took place. Now, Test Fleet is sort of a boring, mundane business case. Jimmy Hoffa and a partner surreptitiously owned part of a trucking company, which is a conflict of interest and a no-no, as we say, it's a legal term, is a no-no if you are the president of the Teamsters Union. And he had allegedly used his influence in the Teamsters Union to obtain favorable labor conditions for his company. So he's placed on trial in Nashville. Now people say, well, how did he come to be in Nashville? Because of the operation of the company, there were two places the trial could have been brought. One was Detroit, Michigan. One was Nashville, Tennessee. Detroit, of course, is Jimmy Hoffa's backyard, so they said, we don't want to have the trial in Detroit. Nashville was a better choice. And here was the other piece. The editor of the Nashville Tennessean was a man named John Siegenthaler. Siegenthaler had at one point been Robert F. Kennedy's secretary. And so they said, this is going to be great. We're going to get favorable news coverage in Nashville. So they brought the case to Nashville, 1962. Now, Nashvillians were not all that interested in this case, in Jimmy Hoffa and his trial. Like I said, it was really a boring piece of business litigation. But also, the first day of the trial coincided with the first day of a little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is an existential threat. Americans are waking up. Are we all going to be alive tomorrow? Are bombs about to be, nuclear bombs about to be dropped? So nobody really cared much about the trial. It ended after about 5 weeks in his acquittal once again. But there was a twist to this case, and the twist was this man, Edward Grady Partin. Remember Edward Grady Partin. He's the key to the entire situation. Partin was the president of Teamsters Local 5 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And he was a mess. I show you this picture because even Partin's brother said Ed was such a good liar, he could fool a lie detector test. Now, at the time the Test Fleet case is beginning, Edward Grady Partin is in a Baton Rouge jail. He's there under a 26-count indictment of tampering with labor records. One of the things that had happened was the government said, we want to come inspect your records, and the safe ended up at the bottom of the river. So he's violated labor laws, 26-count indictment. He's also under a kidnapping indictment. Now, the kidnapping was not what we tend to think of as kidnapping. One of his fellow Teamsters and his wife had gotten a divorce, and he helped squire his friend and the friend's kids away from the wife. So he's under a kidnapping indictment. He contacts the FBI, and the FBI, Walter Sheridan is the man from the FBI who talks with Partin. Partin says, I've got information that relates to Jimmy Hoffa. What he said, the information that everyone believes he said was, I know that Hoffa is going to try to assassinate Robert F. Kennedy. But yada, 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 Walter Sheridan meets with him in a Holiday Inn in Baton Rouge. They determine, well, the Test Fleet trial is about to begin in a couple of days. Partin says, I could try to go up to Nashville and see what I could find. And Walter Sheridan said, that's great, let's have you do this. Call Jimmy Hoffa and see if he'll let you come up to Nashville. We'll let you out of jail and you can go up there. So 2 recordings are made in which Partin calls Jimmy Hoffa, and Hoffa ultimately says, well, why don't you come on up to Nashville? I've got a trial getting ready to occur. Come up to Nashville and we'll talk about your criminal problems and what's going on. These recordings become very important later, so we'll return to those in a little bit. So Partin goes with instructions to go to Nashville. And Walter Sheridan says, and I want you to look while you're up there for any evidence of jury tampering. Well, lo and behold, what does Partin find the first night he gets there? A man he's never met before in his life says, yeah, we're getting ready to try to tamper with the jury. We're going to bribe some jurors. So he calls the FBI and says, yes, I've found evidence. And over the course of the Test Fleet trial, on more than 3 occasions, Partin calls Walter Sheridan with evidence that jurors are being threatened or tampered with. 3 jurors are removed from the jury. So in the wake of the Test Fleet trial, Jimmy Hoffa has been found not guilty. But they begin to investigate and seek an indictment against Jimmy Hoffa and 5 other men. We always call this the Hoffa trial, but there were 5 other men who were all indicted for jury tampering, trial to take place in Nashville. Now the question that always comes up is, well, how do we end up in Chattanooga, the dynamo of Dixie? How do we end up in Chattanooga from Nashville? Well, this is what happens. Of course, there was a lot of publicity in the Nashville trial. But then in the interim, while they're waiting for the new trial, the jury tampering trial to begin, an issue comes up with this man. Of course, this is Jimmy Hoffa on the left. On the right is Tommy Osborne. Tommy Osborne was a Nashville attorney. And he was a very prominent Nashville attorney. He was going to be the rising president of the Nashville Bar Association. He had just argued a very prominent Supreme Court case dealing with voting rights. So he was a rising star in the Nashville legal community. And he was Jimmy Hoffa's local counsel in the test fleet trial. And how this generally works for those of you who aren't lawyers, if you come to Tennessee and you're from out of state and you have out of state attorneys, you generally have to get a local attorney who's familiar with local processes and local rules, and they assist. Tommy Osborne was the local counsel during the test fleet trial, and he was continuing to work with Hoffa on the jury tampering case. One day, a local Nashville policeman, who was sort of an unsavory character himself, appears before the FBI and says, Tommy Osborne is trying to tamper with the jury. Now, this is bold, right? He's going to tamper with the jury in a jury tampering case, right? So they fit the Nashville policeman with a small recording device in the small of his back. And 3 different times he tries to go sit down with Tommy Osborne and get him to talk about plans for tampering with the jury. First time, Tommy Osborne wasn't in his office. The second time, the tape unspooled when they were trying to play it. The third time, he got a tape. And in it, Tommy Osborne says, we're going to pay $5,000 or $10,000 to get to jurors in the jury tampering case. So when the names come out, we're going to see who we know and we're going to work on this. Long, drawn-out tape. Well, where does that tape go immediately? To the federal judges in Nashville. And so number one, and people will say to me, what's the real tragedy of the Jimmy Hoffa case? And it's Tommy Osborne. Osborne said, I just got too close to Jimmy Hoffa. I felt like he was being persecuted by the government. And this was one of the things you really heard from a lot of Hoffa and his team. This wasn't prosecution, it was persecution. They were trying to find anything they could on him. So he said, I was too zealous in the cause of my client, Jimmy Hoffa. Well, he lost his law license and he went to prison for several years. When he came back, he began a fight, Tommy Osborne did, to recover his law license. That fight went as far as the U.S. Supreme Court. He was denied the right to recover his law license, and so one night in 1969, Tommy Osborne went to his West Nashville home, went into his garage, took out a gun, and shot himself in the head. And just one of the shadowy consequences of Jimmy Hoffa, frankly. So with all of that, the Nashville judges, after the Tommy Osborne incident, felt that they had to recuse themselves. They had to remove themselves from the upcoming jury tampering case. So they had to find another judge not in Nashville. So they went to the very close Chattanooga, Tennessee. This is Judge Frank Wilson. And Frank Wilson was a young man. He was a recent appointee. Kennedy had appointed him judge 3 years earlier. He was known as an intellectual judge, and he was known as an even-tempered judge. And that is going to be very important as we get into the Chattanooga case. When anyone does, when I started looking into the Hoffa trial in Chattanooga, you begin with, well, what this case is about Robert F. Kennedy versus Jimmy Hoffa. That's how it starts, right? When it moves to Chattanooga, it becomes about an embattled judge being placed under incredible strain by a defense bent on obtaining a mistrial. And that's what we're going to get to in just a minute. But so when the case goes to Judge Frank Wilson, he immediately transfers the case from Nashville to beautiful, scenic Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it's going to be held in this courthouse. This is the 1933 Art Deco courthouse in Chattanooga. This is still our federal courthouse today. The trial will take place in this courthouse. This is the third floor ceremonial courtroom in Chattanooga. It's beautiful. That the painting in the back is a New Deal era painting called the Allegory of Chattanooga, which is in itself a really interesting story. But if you can't see this very closely, above the judge's chair, sort of center of the picture, is a sword. And what it is described as by the people who built the courthouse, it's the sword of justice. But in this trial, it really made me think a lot about the sword of Damocles. The sword that hangs by a single horsehair. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. And it was really a great symbol for what this trial became. Now, the trial began on January 20 of 1964. Hoffa and his team arrived by airplane the night before. This is Jimmy Hoffa climbing out of the plane as it arrived in Chattanooga. Over his shoulder, the tall man is William Bufalino, one of his attorneys. Bufalino himself was under investigation for some jukebox irregularities during the McClellan committee hearings. He was also the nephew of Russell Bufalino, who was one of the mob bosses of Detroit. And he was one of Hoffa's longtime attorneys. Most of the people who came to Chattanooga with Hoffa were longtime representatives. They felt keenly that Hoffa was being persecuted, and they were going to do what they could to fight back. Now, the government noticed at the same time this trial is beginning that there are some questionable characters coming to Chattanooga who really, they have connections to Hoffa, but no real reason to be there. One of them is getting out of the plane right here. This is Chucky O'Brien. He was sort of a surrogate son to Jimmy Hoffa. When Hoffa was assassinated, he was one of the key individuals investigated. People thought he might have been involved. But there were a few other individuals arriving in town, and so the government decided to place surveillance on a few of those unsavory and questionable characters who were arriving in town. This becomes a key piece of the Hoffa trial because the Hoffa team becomes convinced that the government is also surveilling the defendants and their attorneys. Under the Constitution, you have a Sixth Amendment right to confer with your attorneys. And if you're being surveilled by the government, that's going to impact your ability to talk openly and freely with your attorneys. So that becomes a key issue for the defense, and it's something we'll come back to in just a little bit. Now, I said that Nashville was not interested in the test fleet case. Oh, Chattanoogans were interested. Chattanoogans came out to greet Jimmy Hoffa with signs welcoming Jimmy and Joe, his wife Hoffa, to Chattanooga, thanking him for a recent nationwide contract he had helped negotiate. He was given a motorcycle escort downtown to the hotel he was going to be staying in. So he was welcomed in as a grand figure. Now, the night before the trial, Hoffa always was great with tactics. And one of the great tactics Hoffa engineered was the night before the trial began, he gave a half-hour television interview to the local CBS affiliate. This was something that wasn't done at the time. This was novel. And they wouldn't let you do this today. You know, they're getting ready to pick jurors the next day, and jurors are flipping on, and they're seeing Hoffa talking about how he's being persecuted by the federal government. So just gives you an idea of a total mess that this case became. Now, we're going to talk about the fact that the jury was sequestered in this case, which, again, I know I'm probably going into too much detail, but sequestering is when the jury stays in a hotel. You're not allowed to go home. You've got U.S. Marshals watching you the entire time because they were concerned about security in this case. As I mentioned, Chattanoogans were excited about this trial. The media was excited about this trial. This is what it looked like every day outside the courthouse. National, local, state media waiting for Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa stayed about 2 blocks away, and the media would walk with him in a little knot, back and forth all day, just waiting for some great comment. Hoffa was in an era before the media blurb. Hoffa was great for a blurb. So they would always wait for something great out of Hoffa. So the news was very interested. Chattanoogans were very interested. This is the line of people waiting to get into the courtroom. They said it would wrap around the building every day. And people if you got up and left your seat to go to lunch, you wouldn't be able to get back in. So people would bring their lunches, stay in the little brown bag courtroom lunch. And finally, it got to be so messy that the court said, we're not allowing people to bring lunch in anymore. It was kind of funny. You know, there's an old saying about Woodstock, the Woodstock Festival, that if everybody who told you they went to Woodstock, it would be like 2 million people. That's kind of how the Hoffa trial is. If everybody who has told me that they went to the Hoffa trial actually went, you couldn't have fit it, in a stadium. It's just amazing how many people come, oh yeah, I was always at the Hoffa trial. But people were very interested. And this led to just concerns about security and safety. As I said, the judge made the decision to sequester the jury. This is where they stayed. This is the historic Reed House Hotel. It's about 2 blocks from the courthouse. And the judge told the chief U.S. Marshal, he said, the one thing I want you to do, he said, don't let the Marshal Service create a mistrial. And so the marshal said, he's now deceased, but he said, oh, how seriously we took that every day. So they would every day, 4 times a day, they would take the jury back and forth between the hotel and the courthouse. And they would take them in a little knot with marshals in the back, marshals in the front, marshals along the sides. The chief marshal said the one thing I was most scared of was that someone would try to run a car into the jurors and create a mistrial. And one of the funny little stories involves some newsmen. Some of you may remember Congressman Marilyn Lloyd, one of our Tennessee congressmen years ago. Her husband was Mort Lloyd. He was a local news anchor. And he and his cameraman would interview people all the time. And this is in the days of, we all remember newspaper boxes, where you put your quarter in and open it up and get a... So the marshals, as they were marching the jurors back and forth, a couple of marshals would run ahead and pull over the boxes so they couldn't see the headlines, because you had to insulate the jurors from all the news. They even, in the newspapers, they would cut out all of the articles about Hoffa, the Teamsters, or the trials, had big holes in the newspaper. And they said at night they would all be able to watch TV, but a marshal would sit right next to the TV. And if a commercial, like the news was going to come on or something that would say what's going on, he would click it off for about 30 seconds, then click it back on. So really trying to insulate the jurors. But said one day, Mort Lloyd and his cameraman, actually his cameraman, whose name was Tommy Eason, as the jury was going by, lifted up one of the newspaper boxes, and it had a headline about the trial. And so the chief marshal ran over and said, I'll sort of clean this up a little bit. He said, "Tommy, you stupid SOB." And Mort Lloyd came to his defense and said, "He's not a stupid SOB." And he said, "Yeah, he is, and so are you, and you've lost your guaranteed seats in the courtroom." Because the media had seats set aside. They said every night for the remainder of the trial, Mort Lloyd would stand out in front of the courthouse and say, "I'm Mort Lloyd, and I'm banned from the courtroom, but I'm still reporting." And that really made the chief marshal, even 40 years later, made him angry. He said he wasn't kept out of the courtroom. He just didn't have a guaranteed seat. So people were very interested in this trial. How are we doing? Good? Okay, if you said bad, I was just going to walk in. So this quote refers to Hoffa. He was referred to by newspapermen as a crisp, taut quarterback to his team of lawyer talent. It was a big case. And you can see that this is a diagram that was in the paper of some of the players in the case. There were 5 different defendants. There were 6 defendants total, including Hoffa. There were about a dozen defense lawyers. And one of the early issues in the trial was the layout of the courtroom. Because as you can see, the jury's over here on the right. The prosecution sits here sort of closer to the jury than the defense. And the defense was upset. They said, they're going to feel closer to the prosecution than us because we're way over here. And at one point, one of the attorneys, Cecil Brandstetter, who was a Nashville attorney, he kept complaining, "We need to change the way the courthouse is laid out." And Judge Wilson said, "This is how it's always been laid out. We're not changing it for this trial." And at one point, Brandstetter got upset and he said, "All I can see of the witness is his head and shoulders." And Judge Wilson said, "Well, what other part of him do you need to see?" It was the first couple of weeks of the trial were slow. We had these defendants were trying to show attempts to bribe and threaten and cajole jurors. And so there's a lot of receipts from restaurants, hotel receipts, tracing phone calls among 5 or 6 different people to show the efforts. This is Jim Neal, who was the chief prosecutor in the case. Neal was a Vanderbilt graduate. He was from Nashville. He was a tax lawyer. And Robert F. Kennedy approached him to join the Get Hoffa squad. And Neal said, "I don't have any experience litigating cases. I'm a tax lawyer." And Kennedy said, "Well, I don't have any experience being attorney general either." And so Neal agreed, and he prosecuted the Test Fleet case, and he was the chief prosecutor here. And he said to the newspapers at the time, he said, "This is a complex piece-by-piece puzzle, and we've just got to put together all the pieces." So the first couple of weeks were pretty dry. And they identified several different attempts to bribe or threaten jurors. But what didn't they mention in the first couple of weeks? This guy. Nobody mentioned Jimmy Hoffa for the first couple of weeks. Nobody tied anything into any evidence of an effort by Jimmy Hoffa to direct bribes. Sure, they were bribing jurors, but Jimmy Hoffa wasn't involved in it. And so Jimmy's running around the courthouse kind of like this, big grins. They're all confident. They're sure this is going to be just what he's always accomplished, an acquittal and a finding of not guilty. They were actually one of the only real references to Hoffa in the early days of the trial was in this article called Jimmy Hoffa, G-Y-M-M-Y Hoffa. Just saying, after trial, he goes to the local YMCA and works out. So really, confidence was building in the case that this was going to be another fizzle, this was going to be another acquittal. And then we come to February 4. February 4 is the day the case totally changes. As I mentioned, Edward Grady Partin had gone to Nashville and found these efforts, so-called efforts, to tamper with the jury. At one point during the Test Fleet trial, Hoffa and his team became concerned because they said, every time we're discussing the jury, the next day the court knows about it. So they said, we feel like somebody's listening to us. We need to have more security. We're going to put somebody to guard the door to Hoffa's suite of hotel rooms so that we can cover who goes and comes from these rooms. The individual they selected to guard the suite, Edward Grady Partin. So to a degree, Hoffa placed the fox in the hen house, right? So they kept Partin completely quiet. One of the questionable things the federal government did in this trial is when they brought the indictment and they brought this before the grand jury, they said, what are we going to do about Partin? Because we can't have him testify to the grand jury about what he knows, because then the secret's out. We can't have him not testify before the grand jury, because then they'll suspect that something's up. So the government instructed Partin, appear before the grand jury, but take the fifth. And some people question whether that was really an unethical thing to do in that situation. But so Partin did that, and then they kept Partin in a log cabin on the side of Lookout Mountain during the first couple of weeks of the trial to keep him safe and to keep him under wraps. And then on February 4, they bring him in through a back entrance, up a back elevator, to the office Walter Sheridan maintained at the courthouse. And then they brought him out as the next witness. They said he was a really large man. He was 6'4", weighed about 230. And they said they brought him into the vestibule, waiting to go into the courtroom. They said they said, call your next witness. They didn't even say his name. He just opened the doors and walked in. And the place went crazy when he went in. This is him on the right, big man. Place exploded. Everybody's looking around. The audience doesn't know what's going on, but all of these attorneys who had worked with Hoffa for so long, now they know Partin's a government witness. They know where Partin was during the test fleet trial. He was guarding the suite to the door. He was playing cards with them while they discussed the case. It exploded. They said papers were flying around. Some lawyers were standing and yelling objections out. Audibly, it was heard, oh my God, it's Partin. This totally changed the entire case. So a hearing is held. Here's another picture of Partin talking to a lie detector test. So a hearing was held to determine whether Partin could be allowed to testify. Again, this is that Sixth Amendment problem, right? If the government has placed, a government stooge inside the suites of Hoffa, where Hoffa's attorneys are meeting with their clients, does that prevent him from being able to testify? So the question was, who brought Partin in? And those two tape recordings became very important. They said, did Partin invite himself to Nashville, or did Hoffa invite him to Nashville? And it was found that Hoffa invited Partin, well, come on up to Nashville and we'll talk. Government didn't place him anywhere. Hoffa invited him. And Hoffa voluntarily placed him at the door to his hotel suite. So they said Partin can testify, and he did. And this is where everything changes. Partin shows, here are the 5 attempts to bribe jurors. And here is Jimmy Hoffa being the puppeteer for each and every one of these, saying things like, quote, we've got the colored male juror in our hip pocket. I'll give him $5,000 or $10,000, whatever it takes to flip the jury. Things like that. He's tied Hoffa to every single attempt to bribe the jury. So the whole thing has fallen apart for the defense. And then we come to the cross-examination of Partin. Now, these 3 individuals, the man on the left is Jim Haggerty. He's a Detroit lawyer who is really the chief senior lawyer for Hoffa's team. The man in the middle is Harry Burke. He's a Chattanooga lawyer who was the local counsel for Jimmy Hoffa in this trial. And the man on the far right is Marvin Burke, his son, who was a young lawyer during the trial, sort of carried his father's bags and things like that. Harry Burke was selected to conduct the first cross-examination of Partin, and he cut him to pieces. They knew all about Partin. They knew what a colorful and questionable character Partin was. Cut him to shreds. Partin fell apart on the stand. And then the defense had a critical decision to make. Do we stop there, or do we keep on trucking? And they should have stopped. Everybody, when you talk to the people who are the veterans of this trial, they said they should have stopped there. They had Partin. They destroyed Partin. But here was the thing. All of those other lawyers had worked with Hoffa for so long. They were so loyal to Hoffa. They felt he was being persecuted. They wanted their pound of flesh out of Edward Grady Partin. So each defense lawyer in turn cross-examined Partin. Partin was cross-examined for 6 days on the stand. And they said over time, Partin became stronger again. He regained his footing. He became solid. He was well prepared. And by the end, at the time I wrote my book on this topic, there was one remaining juror who was still alive. And he said, by the end of his testimony, I knew that Partin was the do-it-all, be-all guy for Jimmy Hoffa, and I believed everything he said. So Partin's testimony really changes this case completely, and it changes the defense tactics. What the defense has to do now is to refute Edward Grady Partin, and they try to do that in a number of ways. First of all, this is what the news conferences outside the courthouse looked like every day. That's Jimmy Hoffa smack in the middle. They would just come around him because, again, he's great for a blurb. And he would sit and rail on Edward Grady Partin day after day to the news media. He called Partin's testimony gobbledygook, and that was one of the little headlines, gobbledygook. So he was doing his bit to create media to refute Partin. And of course, the jury's not going to see that, but they're still doing what they can. And they begin to bring in their own witnesses to address Partin. This is again Hoffa. To his left is William Buffalino, one of his chief attorneys, and they begin to bring in witnesses to discredit Edward Grady Partin and make him look bad. A few of the things they did. They accused him of running guns to Cuba. Now, this is 1964, right? We just had the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a very incendiary allegation at the time. Now, what the judge would do on each of these is he would preview the testimony that's going to be given. He'd say, well, we're going to remove the jury. What is this witness going to say? Well, he's going to say he ran guns to Cuba, which is very incendiary, but has nothing to do with this case and has nothing to do with his credibility as a witness. So the judge would say, we're not allowing that testimony. Hoffa became very mad. One of Hoffa's things that he constantly told the media is 60% of this case isn't being heard by the jury, because he was mad that the judge wasn't allowing these things. Some of the other things they alleged that Edward Grady Partin had run over a U.S. soldier in Mississippi and had a hit and run, had hit and killed a soldier and kept on going. Another incendiary thing, because most of the people involved in this trial are veterans. You know, the war was only 2 decades earlier, and so they're all veterans. That's an incendiary allegation. There was another allegation, and I'll use the language of the time, that he had raped a 14-year-old colored girl in Mississippi. There were allegations that he had plans to assassinate Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, just all of these things that they said about Edward Grady Partin. They brought in Partin's estranged wife to testify that he was, and this the terminology of the time, that he was on dope. They brought in a University of Kentucky drug expert to testify that he was on dope, and it backfired because the expert said, I have no evidence to show that he is or ever was addicted to any sort of drug. So they brought in all of these accusations, and the case is starting to ramp up in its intensity as these things are happening. And every single day, both at the beginning of the day and after the lunch break, the defense makes a motion to have a hearing on surveillance because they are convinced that their phones are tapped and that the government is surveilling them, preventing them from cooperating or from talking with their clients. So it's in this environment there are deep concerns about security, and particularly security for Judge Wilson. Now, Judge Wilson lived on Signal Mountain, right outside of Chattanooga, and they posted U.S. Marshals all around his house, in the woods around his house, across the street in the neighbor's house, because they were very concerned about potential activities to try to kidnap or harm the judge or his family. One of the attorneys I worked with for years was a guy named Randy Wilson. It was his son. Randy was 7 at the time, and he was taken every day to and from school by U.S. Marshals. He said, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. But the family was obviously very scared about what might happen. But there are a couple of great stories from the marshal. The chief marshal running security at the judge's house was a man named Granville Sertel. And Sertel said that every 2 weeks they would switch out the marshals who were staying up on the mountain. And said every time he would gather them together and sort of walk through what they did, and he would say, now, if anything happens, if there's a fire or a bombing or anything, you see that front corner bedroom on the first floor, first thing you do is get the man out of that bedroom. And they would say, okay, that's Judge Wilson's room. And he said, nope, that's my room. And there was a great, we interviewed Judge Wilson's wife when she was in her 90s. She has since passed away, but she told the story. She said one night there was a knock at the door about midnight. And she came down, and the marshals are saying, no, but she opens the door. And there's a disheveled man in a fur coat, clearly inebriated, and they said that one of the U.S. Marshals is about to run out and tackle him, and they stop. She says, it turns out he was the local town drunk just looking for work. And then she said, I didn't know we had a local town drunk. Little stuff like that. So security was a concern, and things are continuing to ramp up. The defense said, okay. The government had their surprise witness. Here's our surprise witness. And they called this man, Fred Shoby. Fred Shoby was described in many news accounts as a 250-pound four-time loser, i.e. he had been in prison 4 times. And he came and testified. Now, what he testified was that he was part of the Get Hoffa squad, that he was a, quote, agent provocateur who had been hired during the test fleet case by Walter Sheridan and the FBI to go into the black community in Nashville and stir it up against Robert F. Kennedy and the government. And to make them, black jurors want to support Jimmy Hoffa in that trial. His testimony, again, previewed testimony outside the presence of the jury. They said he slurred, he was clearly under the influence of something. He testified that there had been voodoo ceremonies in Nashville to try to influence testimony in favor of the federal government, that the federal government had planned to kidnap a couple of the witnesses, make them think it was Hoffa's guys that were going to kill him, but then have the federal government ride in on a white horse and save him, which would make them want to testify for the federal government. Crazy stuff. And ultimately the judge said, this isn't related to this. This isn't really believable. He only allowed about that much of Fred Shoby's testimony. And Shoby was left out. Again, this angers Hoffa even more. Now, one of the interesting things about Fred Shoby, though, is Walter Sheridan. Walter Sheridan, FBI, part of the Get Hoffa squad. Sheridan was in the courthouse throughout the trial. He was in the courtroom for a lot of the trial. All Walter Sheridan had to probably do was be called as a witness and say, that guy never worked for the Get Hoffa squad. That's all made up. That never happened. Sheridan never testified, which creates some real questions about that situation. And it was brought up by the defense in their appeals. Why didn't Walter Sheridan testify? Where's Walter Sheridan? So just kind of an interesting little development. Now, see how are we doing? Oh, we're doing great. Okay. As the trial is beginning to slow down, the prosecution rests. There is another move by the defense. Okay, right now this is a good time to have a hearing on all this surveillance that's going on. The judge says, look, we've got a sequestered jury. They're having to stay away from home. We're going to have that hearing after all the proof is in. Move forward. Of course, the defense is very upset by this time. Everybody is looking forward to one person's testimony, and that is Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa is going to testify towards the end of the trial, really. I put this picture in just because I think it's a neat little story. The person sort of standing there ramrod straight on the right is Jim Neal, the head prosecutor. And Neal developed a kind of a rapport with Hoffa. In this picture, Hoffa is walking by. He's on the left, and you can see him kind of smiling. Jim Neal had been a Marine, and so as he walked by, Hoffa yelled out, "The Marines are landing!" And everybody kind of laughed. Said Hoffa, every day, Hoffa would come over to Jim Neal and say, look, we could save a lot of time and money if you and I would just wrestle to settle this. They kind of laughed. And he said later on, Hoffa called Neal the hardest, most dislikable prosecutor I ever knew. And Neal was actually a little bit hurt by it. He said, I felt like we had a good rapport. But he said every day, though, every day during the trial, when I would look over at Hoffa, he'd be flipping me off under the table. And he said, you can't imagine what that does to your psyche over a 6-week trial. You're afraid to look over there after a while. Now, people are starting to look forward to Jimmy Hoffa's testimony. Hoffa, like I said, is always combative, extremely smart, extremely good at working around questions and not answering things, so they're ready. But here was the concern Hoffa had. By this time, because of all of the Partin testimony, they know that the government has at least 2 recordings of Hoffa. He doesn't know how many more there might be. Actually, the government played up on this. The day that Hoffa was slated to testify, Jim Neal and some of the other lawyers worked up a little dolly cart, and they put some machinery on it with some like antennas and knobs. They called it a Rube Goldberg-like device. And in the break before Hoffa was set to testify, one of the attorneys ran down the hall pushing this cart and ran it into one of the FBI offices, just to create this, what are they going to do while I'm testifying? What is that machine? What do they know? So they said, as a result of this, Hoffa did not, and these are some of the pictures of Hoffa during the trial, Hoffa did not give a vintage Hoffa performance. He was afraid to take hard positions because he didn't know if there were recordings out there that would prove that he did say something he declined. So he equivocated on a lot of his testimony. He didn't do a great job. And so it hurt him a little bit. And so at this time, we're getting to the point where the defense is extremely worried about the trend this case is on. And that's when we come to the point of what they called the vociferous flamethrower and the mysterious Exhibit 249. This man is the vociferous flamethrower. This is Jack Schiffer. Schiffer was a high-priced New York attorney. He represented one of the other defendants in the case, a man named Tom Parks. Now, Tom Parks was basically a poor handyman who lived in Nashville. He was a poor black man from Nashville. And people questioned, how does a poor black handyman from Nashville come to pay a high-priced New York lawyer? Well, it was fairly evident to everyone, Hoffa was paying that bill. He was a stand-in there for Hoffa, and Hoffa liked him because he was a loudmouth. He would get up and he would yell in cases and take these long diatribes. Actually, one judge in Puerto Rico at the end of a trial told him, if I ever find that you've set foot on this island again, I'm going to have you put in jail. Just because he was that difficult of a lawyer. Here he is, Tom Parks, Schiffer's on the right, Tom Parks, his client, just as his side, and Larry Campbell, the other black defendant in the case, is on the left side of the picture. So Schiffer made it his goal, likely at Hoffa's insistence, to try to get a mistrial. They called what he did a bitter inch-by-inch struggle against the introduction of testimony in the case. It was said in the papers, I don't see how this is possible, that he objected 167 times in 1 hour. Just constant objections. And then he would go on these long railing diatribes just against the case and against how the case was being prosecuted. And this turned from, yes, of course, he was talking about the federal government, but now he's also talking about the court. They're angry. The court has let in Partin's testimony. The court hasn't allowed all of their testimony. And so he's very angry, and he began to use phrases. Here he is on the right, and he's on the left of the picture is Cecil Brandstetter, a prominent Nashville attorney who was involved in the case. He began to refer to things. He would call the trial, this is a drumhead court-martial. He would call it a star chamber proceeding. And my favorite is, he said, this case smacks of Hitlerism, Mussolinism, and all the other isms. And he would rail about how the court was allowing this and how the court was fostering it. And it was interesting, this is where the even-tempered nature of Judge Wilson came into play. It was fairly evident that the defense was trying to get Judge Wilson to blow his stack, lose his temper, secure a mistrial. And in that, we had the best person we could have, because he was very even-tempered. He would sit through, in the transcript of this trial, and the transcript is actually, the judge's copy of the transcript is at the Howard Baker Center here in town. And in that 2,000-plus page transcript, Judge Wilson, at the end of these long 20-page diatribes by Jack Schiffer, he would make little marks with a pencil. There, you can still see them, these little X's. Now, every night, this is kind of the interesting part of this case, and just realize how relentless this was. Trial took 6 weeks. Every night, the judge would go home. He would have dinner with his family. He said he wanted to make things for his family as normal as possible. Then at about 9 o'clock that night, the court reporters would come up with that day's transcripts they had just finished, and he would stay up till about 3 in the morning reading through the transcripts and then go again. It was actually said that the big winners of the trial were the court reporters. Said one of the court reporters bought a new house in a fashionable part of town just off of what he made on the trial transcripts from the Hoffa trial. But so you can think of the pressure that's on the judge and how this is going on and on, but he would make marks in the transcript of where Schiffer had engaged in his diatribes. And he's going to return to this a little bit later. But so Schiffer's trying anything he can do to obtain a mistrial, and it's not really working. Now, the defense is very concerned, as I said, about surveillance, and every day they're bringing this up. At the end of the proof, the judge allows them to have a hearing on surveillance. Now, what you're looking at in this picture, this is the west side of Chattanooga. Downtown, you're looking kind of the edge of Chattanooga looking off into the west. This was what, in 1964, was our urban renewal area. About 1,600 homes had been torn down in this area as a part of urban renewal. And so, as they said at the time, it is an open moonscape. And so at one point, even the defense became so concerned about surveillance that they decided, well, let's get 4 of us in a car, let's go drive out into the Golden Gateway Project where there's nothing, it's desolate, and we can meet and confer privately without the government surveilling us. And to this day, Marvin Burke, who is in his late 70s, and he was the man driving the car at the time, he was 26 or so at the time, he said, we were followed, and every time I would speed up, the car behind us would speed up. If I slowed down, the car behind me would slow down. If I stopped, they would stop. They were convinced. He said at one point he had a friend that he had lunch with or dinner with, and he said, look, after you meet with me, you're going to be followed by the federal government. And he said the guy actually, who wasn't from Chattanooga, actually was driving back after that dinner, went the wrong way down a one-way street, and a car followed him. So they are convinced to this day that there was surveillance. And actually, we did a documentary about this, and we interviewed Jim Neal. And at one point, he said, you know, we thought we were right, they thought they were right, and he kind of trailed off. And we used it in the video just to kind of show, okay, there are questions. And there was a panel, and Jim, he has since died, but in the panel, and he was this gruff cigar and whiskey sounding guy, and he said, I want to say something. There have been questions about surveillance, and was there wiretapping in this trial? And I want to say one thing, bullshit. And what he said is, he says, yes, there was surveillance of unsavory characters who had no reason to be in the town wondering what they were going to do. There was no surveillance of the defense or their attorneys, and no one was wiretapping, which wiretapping was the crime. But the defense became even more concerned, and they were really concerned about wiretapping. They were convinced that when they picked up their phones, they could hear little clicks and whizzes. And so they brought in this man. That's on the left is Bernard Spindell, the #1 wiretapping expert in the United States. He's talking with Jimmy Hoffa there. Hoffa used him a lot for things. So they brought Spindell into town, and they said, Spindell, we want you to see if you find evidence of wiretapping. And if you do, if you don't find evidence of wiretapping, just pack up and go home. If you do, I want you to write it down, put it in an affidavit, seal it up, and hand it to Jack Schiffer. And that's what he did. He handed them an affidavit, partly typed up, partly handwritten. It still exists. It's in the National Archives. It's still sealed. But he handed it to Jack Schiffer, and Schiffer shows up in court and says, I want to file this as Exhibit 249. Judge Wilson says, what is it? And Schiffer says, I don't know. And the judge said, well, how can you file something if you don't know what it is? And here's the thing. In the 1960s, it was not a crime to wiretap. Wiretap meaning you tap a line so you can listen in on two other people talking. The crime was in disclosing what the wiretap revealed. So by wiretapping, Spindell committed no crime, but whoever disclosed that affidavit was committing a federal crime. And so the judge became very upset. He said, you're asking the court to do something that you can't do because you say it's illegal. You want the court to do something illegal to protect you from doing something illegal. So the judge would not, he would not allow that piece of, that exhibit to be entered. It's never been opened. Of course, now the defense is even more incensed, and they feel like the judge won't even look at this evidence. And that's one of the big themes of this trial. Now, in case you were getting tired, thought this would snap you back up, hookers. We come to the end of the trial, and we come to closing statements. This is a picture, it was referred to as happy prosecutors. On the left is Jim Neal. Jack Reddy is next to him. He's the local Chattanooga prosecutor. And then John J. Hooker and his wife. We're all probably familiar with John J. Hooker Jr., who ran for governor a few times. This is his father, who was he was the other key lawyer for the prosecution. This is them leaving the courthouse after the verdict. Closing statements were wild, as you might expect. I mean, almost every attorney, it's almost like they came to the South and said, the two things I've got to do are infer that I grew up on a farm. And these are guys from Detroit and New York, like, oh, I remember the old farm days. And number two, talk about the Bible. Nearly every one of them had a biblical allegory that they utilized. The one that Jim Neal used was Jacob and Esau. He said the hands may have been those of Tom Parks or one of the other defendants, but the voice was that of Jimmy Hoffa, the voice telling them to commit the crime. Most of the defense counsel focused their closings on Edward Grady Partin. They called it a foul, filthy frame-up that he had engaged in to try to basically get out of jail, save his neck by throwing Hoffa under the bus. The best one, of course, the last one, Jack Schiffer. The entire time of his long diatribe of his closing statement, Schiffer had his hand in his pocket, jingling around a bunch of change. And at the end, he turned to the prosecution table and said, "You've worked hard for your 30 pieces of silver," alluding to Judas Iscariot. "Now you can have it," and threw the handful of coins across the table. And of course, Judge Wilson kept his calm and said, well, he cleared the courtroom. And it was great in the news reports at the time. Reporters afterwards crawled around on the floor picking up all the coins. And they said, they noted carefully, there were 24, not 30 coins. The jury goes in to deliberate. This is while the surveillance hearing is going on, while the jury is deliberating. It was a very short deliberation. The jury came out, and in the verdict, found Hoffa and 3 of the other men guilty of jury tampering. They found 2 of the men not guilty. I just love this picture. This is of Teamsters reading the verdict in the paper. This is going to be the beginning of the end for Jimmy Hoffa. Now, the judge then calls for the sentencing portion of this. I started scheduling. He started to call for the sentencing portion, and he issued an interesting order. He said, I want the defendants and their counsel to be present for the sentencing, which is a little bit odd. Nobody said, what's this all about? So they go to the sentencing. Hoffa receives a sentence of 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The other 3 defendants that were found guilty, lesser prison sentences and fines. And then he says, I'd like to call Mr. Schiffer up. And that's when the judge gained his revenge. He found Schiffer in criminal contempt of court for what he had done and sentenced him to 30 days in jail at the Maxwell Air Force Base and a hefty fine. And what he did, the judge in his closing remarks said, when we deal usually with issues in this courtroom, someone has lost property or something has been done to someone physically to harm them. What you have done, Jimmy Hoffa, is instead tamper with the very soul of this nation. The right to a fair court resolution, the rights of the courts. And so he was regarded as a very wonderful judge. One of the things in talking with people about the Hoffa case, to this day, there are deep divisions on whether there was surveillance, whether Edward Grady Partin was lying, whether the federal government was fair. But the one thing that everyone said was, there was never a finer man than Frank Wilson. Both sides said that he was just the kind of man who would never allow, if the elevator door opened and he was going to get on and one of the parties was in the elevator, he would take the stairs because he didn't want any appearance of impropriety. Now, in their effort, 2 more slides and then I'll shut up. In their effort to overcome this verdict, the Hoffa team went to great lengths. Well, they did. First, they moved several members of Congress to begin a congressional investigation into whether the federal government had misbehaved in persecuting Hoffa. That got some publicity, but never really went anywhere. They filed an appeal, as you would expect. They appealed 94 errors, they alleged. Everything from the selection of the jury to allowing Partin to testify to not allowing a lot of their evidence in to surveillance. That eventually made it to the Supreme Court, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But they did a few other things. One of the key things they realized the key to this case is Partin. So if we can get Partin to change his testimony, to say that he had been lying, we can get this whole thing taken care of. So they made efforts to bribe Partin. They offered him up to $1 million to recant his testimony. They threatened Partin. They said, if you don't recant your testimony, you're going to find yourself chained up to a log and thrown in the river one night. They engaged politicians, judges in New Orleans to try to sit and convince Partin to change his testimony. They even utilized the efforts of the most decorated soldier in World War II. They got Audie Murphy to come and meet with Partin to try to convince him to change his testimony. Audie Murphy was killed in a plane crash. Partin was supposed to be on that plane, but he made up a story about his mother being sick and didn't go on the plane. Makes you wonder, but Partin never recanted his testimony. In later years, Partin said, I'm really sorry about what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, and I wish it hadn't happened. But he never recanted his testimony. The defense team, some of the local lawyers, and I always tell people when I'm in Chattanooga, I won't say who, but some of the local lawyers engaged in other efforts to try to change the outcome. First, they went to bellhops and elevator operators at the Reed House Hotel, and they got them to sign affidavits that the U.S. Marshals plied them with alcohol and had big wild parties, which would have been wrong, which could have caused a mistrial. Reed House immediately fired all those people, and they found jobs in Teamster-owned hotels soon thereafter. The greatest event of all is that they, as they said, they trolled the underbelly of Chattanooga, and they found 3 prostitutes who testified that the federal government, U.S. Marshals, had hired the prostitutes to sleep with male members of the jury. And that talking with people, and most people would say this, it almost worked, but they made one mistake. They said that the government had also hired prostitutes for Judge Wilson, and that Judge Wilson had confided to the prostitutes, I'm going to get that SOB Hoffa. And everybody that you talked to said, well, the minute they said that, we knew it was a lie. Because that's the kind of faith people had in Judge Wilson. I mean, just a remarkable man. And that's why I told you at the beginning, that's what this case became about, an embattled judge trying to fight against really, just inhuman amounts of pressure in that case. It was interesting. I was talking with his chief clerk, and a clerk is usually a young lawyer who works as the clerk to the court. He is now deceased as well, but his name was Charlie Gearheiser. And talking with him 50 years after the trial, he broke into tears talking about what a man Judge Wilson was. And it was really, that became, for me, that's the story of this trial. Now, ultimately, the case went to the Supreme Court. Here's Jimmy in one of his later visits. He's got that coat because he's handcuffed. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in an 8-1 decision, the court affirmed the guilty verdict, and so he's going to go to prison. The one who dissented was Chief Justice Earl Warren, and Warren really found there had been an affidavit from Partin's jail cellmate in Baton Rouge who said Partin had told him, it's either Hoffa's head or mine. I'm going to save mine, and so Warren really felt that Partin could not be believed, that he had traded his own criminal possibilities for this. And the interesting thing about it is that 26-count indictment, that kidnapping charge, were never prosecuted. So there's some real questions that still exist about how this case was handled. Hoffa ends up about 1967. By the time all of his appeals are run, he goes to prison. He's sent to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. In 1971, he is released early on the orders of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Around that. People sometimes say to me, that's odd, because we think of labor unions, we think of the Democratic Party. But remember, Hoffa despised the Kennedy boys so much, he threw his power and the Teamsters' power behind Richard M. Nixon. Now, anybody seen the movie The Irishman? Okay, this next part is what The Irishman is about. Hoffa claimed that he did not know one of the conditions of his release was that he would have no leadership role in the Teamsters Union for a decade, until about 1980. And it was the thing he cared about most in the world. And so he began a campaign to recover his Teamsters presidency, going so far as to threaten to reveal the ties between the current Teamsters leadership and organized crime. Now let me ask you, dear friends, what happens to you when you threaten to reveal the ties between your organization and the mob? You don't come home from lunch, right? And so that's what happens. Of course, in 1975, Jimmy Hoffa disappears while in Detroit. And unless he's with Elvis somewhere right now, he's presumed dead. I told you I'd tell you where he's buried. I don't know. I lied, just to keep you here. But I do think, in closing, I do think that you can draw a direct line back from Hoffa's disappearance in 1975 to the events that occurred in this little courthouse in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that really set into motion the machinery that would lead to his ultimate disappearance. So it's an interesting story. I always tell people, people who want to talk about Chattanooga history topics, it's the number 2 topic people always want to hear about. Number 1 is underground Chattanooga, the building up of streets to prevent flooding. There are all these mysterious underground basements. But Hoffa is the number 2, and I think a lot of people were surprised to hear Jimmy Hoffa associated with East Tennessee. So that's what I came to talk about. I hope it was a little bit helpful, a little bit informative. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
How tall was Hoffa?
Short. Hoffa was about 5'7" or 5'9". He was a short guy, but like a lot of short guys, no offense, short guys, but a lot of short guys, he compensated for that by being a real battler. So he was a bruiser. Yeah.
Napoleon complex.
It may be. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How did they say Partin was such a liar when he had the tape recordings and it seemed to be proved that Hoffa did the inviting of him?
Yeah, I think that was a close call, but I think they made the right decision, right? They had recordings where Hoffa said, "Come to Nashville." So that's a close call. What they didn't have recordings of were all of these things Hoffa apparently said, I'm going to get jurors. We're going to bribe this juror. We're going to bribe that juror.
I thought he did have recordings.
No, there were only those 2 recordings. Nobody knew if there were others, but those were the only 2. And so there were really some questions. I mean, one of the questions was, Partin's, his message is go to Nashville, go to Nashville. Go to Nashville and see if you see any jury tampering. The night he arrives, he sits down in a bar with a guy from West Virginia he's never met before. They've just been introduced. And the guy tells him they're going to try to bribe a juror. And some people were just like, that's just a little bit too much to believe. So there were some questions. And, his credibility was, he was an unsavory fellow. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The document that was sealed, that's never been opened, Is it still illegal for someone to?
Nah, I don't think so by this time. I mean, I saw it and I was like, you know, one of those, but I was like, I can't do that. Can't tamper with it. But yeah, no one would care now. I'll tell you what is funny though, when I was interviewing the last living juror, it's funny, I said, hey, I'd like to talk with you about the Hoffa trial. He's like, I don't know about that. You know, Hoffa and his guys, I don't know. And I was like, it's been 50 years. So he finally did talk with us. But yeah, so it would be interesting. And you know, the other thing that's still in there, and you're afraid to mess with it, but you know, one of those old reel-to-reel tape recordings, that was a tape recording that Hoffa's team made of Fred Shobe, testifying about all the things he did for the Get Hoffa. It's still there. It's sitting there. Those things are kind of neat, and they're very tempting, you know. Yes, sir.
Your slide that showed the headline that he was convicted.
Yeah.
Below it was a picture, I think, of Jack and Jackie. Was there some tie, or that was just a coincidence?
Let's see. Yeah, probably just a coincidence. You know, the ties between, or not ties between, but the issues between Jack Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa are really tenuous. There are people who think Hoffa was involved somehow in the assassination, and that's a whole other topic. But he was really more, his hatred was more Bobby Kennedy. And you know, Kennedy had a big party after the trial and brought people up to his home in Virginia to celebrate. And like brought in the prosecution team and stuff. And he actually asked the judge, well, come on up. And the judge was like, I can't go to the celebration of this verdict. But said it was really interesting. The chief marshal, he did tell him, yeah, you go on up. You can go to that. And the marshal went, and somebody mentioned, they said to Bobby Kennedy's wife, said, you know, he's a Republican. And she said, today we love Republicans too. So, any other burning questions? Well, great. Thank y'all so much. I really enjoyed it. Y'all are a great audience. I had a good time. Thank you.